The guards seized Alira Voss in front of the entire court, and she did not understand why until the crown itself was pulled from her hair. Gasps filled the grand hall. Nobles who had bowed to her only a week earlier now stepped back as if she carried a disease. Her father, the old king, stood frozen at the top of the stairs, his face pale with something that looked like fear rather than sorrow. Alira searched his eyes for comfort and found none. "You are charged with conspiring against the crown," announced Lord Hensworth, the king's advisor, his voice echoing through the marble hall. "Letters bearing your seal have been found, promising secrets of this kingdom to a rival house." "I wrote no such letters," Alira said, her voice steady despite the storm rising in her chest. "I have never betrayed my family or my people." No one listened. The court had already decided her guilt before she entered the room. She watched as the betrothal contract binding her to Prince Edmund of Larkspire was torn in half by his own father, the announcement made without hesitation, without a shred of doubt given in her favor. Edmund did not even look at her as he was led away. 2 weeks earlier, he had kissed her hand and called her his future queen. Now he could not meet her eyes. She was escorted to a small chamber at the edge of the palace, stripped of her guards, her fine gowns, and most of her dignity. The window overlooked the training yard, where soldiers sparred beneath a gray sky, and she pressed her palm against the cold glass, trying to steady her breathing. Someone had done this to her. Someone had planted those letters, forged her seal, and destroyed her future in a single afternoon. But who would gain from ruining a princess who had never wronged anyone? 3 days later, a name spread through the palace that made her blood run cold. Duke Cassian Rourke had petitioned the king for her hand in marriage. Alira nearly laughed when she heard it. The Rourke family had despised the Voss line for over a decade, ever since Cassian's father lost his lands and his title in a dispute that the old king had ruled against him. Cassian had grown up watching his family's fortune crumble, forced to rebuild everything through sheer stubbornness and cunning. He had made his fortune trading grain and iron across 3 kingdoms, buying back half of what his family lost, and gaining a duke's title through service to a neighboring lord who needed his gold more than his loyalty. He was not a man known for kindness. He was known for winning. And now the court whispered that he wanted to marry the disgraced princess. "He does not want you for love," her lady's maid, Beatrice, whispered, as she helped Alira dress for the meeting the king had arranged. "Forgive me for saying so, your highness, but everyone in the palace believes he wants to humiliate you, to make the Voss name kneel before the Rourke name, the way his family once knelt before yours." Alira said nothing, but she suspected Beatrice was right. She had met Cassian only once, years before, at a summer gathering where he had watched her dance with a stare so cold it made her shiver, even in the warm evening air. He had not spoken a single word to her that night. He had simply watched, the way a man watches something he intends to take apart later. The meeting took place in the king's private study, a room with high shelves of old books and a fire that crackled weakly in the corner. Alira entered wearing a plain gray dress, the finest gowns having been taken from her along with her title. Cassian stood near the window, tall and composed, dressed in dark green and black, his hair the color of wet stone, his expression unreadable. When she entered, he turned to look at her, and for a moment, something flickered across his face that she could not name. Then it vanished, replaced by the same cold calculation she remembered from years ago. "Princess Alira," the king said, though the title now sounded hollow even in his own mouth. "Duke Rourke has offered to take you as his wife. Given your circumstances, I believe this is a generous offer, and one you should accept." "Generous," Alira repeated quietly. She turned to Cassian. "Why would you want to marry a woman the entire kingdom believes to be a traitor?" Cassian's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Perhaps I see value where others see ruin," he said. "Or perhaps I simply enjoy owning what once refused to acknowledge my family's existence." The honesty of his cruelty was almost refreshing. At least he did not pretend affection he did not feel. Alira lifted her chin, refusing to let him see how deeply his words landed. "And if I refuse? You have no lands, no title, no allies, and no future within these walls," the king said before Cassian could answer. "Refusing this offer means a life in a convent at best, or worse, depending on how the court's mood shifts in the coming weeks. I suggest you consider carefully, daughter." The word daughter felt like an insult now, spoken with no warmth at all. Elira understood, in that moment, that her father had already abandoned her in every way that mattered. He needed the scandal to disappear, and marrying her off to a duke eager to take her, regardless of his reasons, was the cleanest way to make her vanish from public conversation. She looked at Cassian again. His eyes held no pity, no softness, nothing she could use to bargain or plead. Only the quiet satisfaction of a man who had waited a long time for an opportunity like this one. "I will marry you," she said, "but I want to know one thing first. Do you believe I am guilty of what they accuse me of?" Cassian studied her for a long moment. "It does not matter to me whether you are guilty or innocent," he said. "What matters is that the daughter of the family, who destroyed mine, will now wear my name, sleep under my roof, and answer to me. That is enough." His words should have broken her. Instead, something inside Elira hardened into resolve. If he wanted a broken woman to torment, he would be disappointed. She would give him nothing to enjoy. The wedding took place 5 days later, in a small chapel, at the edge of the city, far from the grand cathedral, where royal weddings were normally held. No crowds gathered to celebrate. No bells rang in celebration. A handful of witnesses stood in the cold stone room, including Lord Hensworth, who seemed almost gleeful at the sight of the fallen princess, exchanging vows with the very man whose family she had unknowingly wronged. Elira wore a simple ivory dress, without jewels, without a crown. Cassian wore black, his expression carved from stone throughout the ceremony. When the priest asked if he would take Elira as his lawful wife, he answered without hesitation, his voice flat and businesslike, as though signing a contract rather than making a vow. When it was her turn, Elira forced her voice to remain steady, refusing to let a single tremor betray the storm inside her chest. There was no kiss to seal the marriage. Cassian simply nodded to the priest, took Elira's arm, and led her out of the chapel, toward a carriage, waiting to take them to his estate outside the city walls. Neither of them spoke during the ride. Elira watched the passing countryside, green hills rolling beneath a heavy sky, and wondered what kind of life waited for her at the end of this road. The Rourke estate was smaller than the palace, but it was built with sharp lines and dark stone, giving it an air of quiet authority rather than warmth. Servants lined the entrance as the carriage arrived, their faces carefully blank, though Elira could feel their curiosity pressing against her like a physical weight. She was, after all, the fallen princess now married to their master, the woman whose family had once humiliated the Rourke name. Cassian helped her from the carriage with mechanical politeness, his hand cold against hers. "This is your home now," he said, gesturing toward the entrance. "You will find your chambers on the east side of the house. I trust you will not need my company beyond what is required for appearances." "Appearances," Elira repeated. "You are my wife in name," Cassian said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "That is all you will ever be. I did not marry you for affection, and I expect none in return. We will attend gatherings together when necessary. We will present a picture of unity to the court. Beyond that, I have no interest in your presence." Elira felt the sting of his words, but she refused to let it show on her face. "Then I suppose we understand each other perfectly," she said, matching his cold tone with one of her own. "I did not marry you for affection either, Duke Rourke. I married you because I had no other choice." Something flickered in his eyes again, quick and unreadable, before he turned and walked into the house without another word. Her chambers were plain but comfortable, a stark contrast to the grandeur she had known in the palace. A narrow bed sat beneath a tall window overlooking the estate's gardens, and a small writing desk occupied the corner, empty of any personal items. Elira sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, for the first time since the accusations began, a single moment of quiet grief. She pressed her palms against her eyes and breathed slowly, forcing the tears back before they could fall. She would not give this house her tears. She would not give Cassian Rourke the satisfaction of seeing her break. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. A young servant girl entered, carrying a tray of simple food and a pitcher of water. She could not have been older than 16, with dark curls tied back neatly and wide, nervous eyes. "My name is Grace, Your Grace," the girl said, then flushed at her own words. "I mean, Your Highness. I am not certain what to call you now." Elira offered her a small, tired smile. "Elira will do just fine." Grace's eyes widened slightly, as though surprised by the kindness in her voice. "The Duke asked me to see that you have everything you need," she said, setting the tray down carefully. He said you are to remain in the East Wing unless invited elsewhere. Invited, Alira murmured. How generous of him. Grace hesitated at the door before speaking again. Forgive me for saying so, Your Highness, but the staff has heard many things about you. Not all of them kind. I do not know what is true and what is rumor, but I thought you should know people are watching you closely here. Thank you, Grace, Alira said. I imagine they will find very little to talk about. I intend to give them nothing. The girl left, and Alira ate a small portion of the food before setting the tray aside. She rose and walked to the window, looking out over gardens that had clearly once been beautiful, but now sat somewhat neglected, as though no one had cared for them in years. She wondered, briefly, what kind of childhood Cassian Rourke had lived through, what losses had carved such coldness into a man who once, according to old court rumors, had been known for his charm before his family's fall from grace. It did not matter, she told herself. He was her enemy now, disguised as her husband. And if there was one thing Alira Voss understood, it was how to survive among enemies. She had grown up in a court full of smiling faces hiding sharp knives. She had learned, long before this marriage, how to keep her expression calm, while her mind worked quietly beneath the surface. Someone had framed her for treason. Someone had wanted her removed from the palace, stripped of her title, and pushed into obscurity. She intended to discover who and why, no matter how long it took, no matter what walls stood in her way. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the wind moving through the trees outside her window, Alira made herself a quiet promise. She would not simply endure this marriage. She would use it. Somewhere within these walls, within the enemies who now surrounded her, there might be answers about her fall from grace, threads she could pull to understand who truly wanted her ruined. Cassian Rourke believed he had married a broken woman, a trophy to display his triumph over a family that once wronged his own. He believed she had nothing left to offer except her humiliation. He was wrong. Alira closed her eyes, and for the first time since the accusations began, she felt something other than grief settle over her. It was resolve, sharp and quiet, the kind that would carry her through whatever waited in the days ahead. She had lost her crown, her betrothed, and the trust of her own father. But she had not lost herself, and she refused to let this cold house, or its colder master, take that from her as well. Somewhere beyond these walls, the truth waited to be uncovered, and Alira intended to find it, no matter the cost. The first morning in the Rourke estate arrived gray and quiet, rain tapping softly against the tall windows of her chamber. Alira woke before dawn out of habit, a routine built from years of early lessons in etiquette, politics, and the careful art of appearing perfect in front of a watching court. Old habits, she realized, did not simply disappear because a crown had been taken away. She dressed in the plain clothing left for her, a simple wool dress far removed from the silk and lace she once wore, and made her way downstairs, curious to see more of the house that would now confine her days. The halls were narrow compared to the palace, lined with portraits of Rourke ancestors, whose stern faces seemed to follow her as she passed. She paused, before one painting in particular, a young boy standing beside an older man, both dressed in fine clothing that seemed slightly too grand for their surroundings, as though borrowed for the occasion of the portrait. That was painted before everything fell apart, a voice said behind her. Alira turned to find Cassian standing a few steps away, dressed for the day in simple riding clothes, his expression guarded as always. She had not expected to encounter him this early, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Your father?" she asked, gesturing to the painting. "My father," Cassian confirmed. "Before your family's court stripped him of his lands, and left us with nothing but this house, and a title that meant little, without wealth behind it. I was a child when that happened," Alira said carefully. "I had no part in whatever ruling caused your family's fall." "No," Cassian agreed, his voice flat. "But you carried the name that caused it, and now I carry the satisfaction of watching that name kneel under my roof." Alira felt the familiar sting of his words, but refused to let it show. "If satisfaction is truly what you seek, Duke Rourke, I fear you will be disappointed. I do not intend to kneel for anyone, least of all a man who married me simply to settle an old grudge." Something shifted in his gaze, quick and difficult to read, before he turned away. "Breakfast is served in the dining hall within the hour," he said. "I expect you to join me." We must at least appear united when the staff and visitors are present. Of course, Alira replied. Appearances matter greatly to men who have nothing else to offer. She did not wait for his response, walking past him toward the dining hall with her chin held high, refusing to let him see how deeply his coldness affected her. Behind her, she thought she heard something close to surprise, in the silence he left in his wake, but she did not turn back to confirm it. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Cassian spent most mornings attending to matters of his estate and trade contracts that stretched across 3 kingdoms, leaving Alira largely alone within the confines of the house. She used the solitude wisely, walking the halls slowly, observing the staff, listening carefully to conversations not meant for her ears, gathering small pieces of information, the way she once gathered political alliances in the palace. She learned quickly that the household staff were divided in their loyalty. Some, like young Grace, seemed to hold quiet sympathy for her situation, uncertain what to believe about the scandal that had ruined her name. Others, older servants who remembered the Rourke family's fall firsthand, watched her with open resentment, as though her very presence in the house was an insult they were forced to endure. One such servant, an older woman named Margaret, who managed the household staff, made her disdain clear from the very first conversation. "I do not know what game the Duke intends to play by bringing you here," Margaret said one afternoon, finding Alira in the study, reviewing old ledgers she had discovered on a shelf. "But do not mistake his cruelty for anything less than what it is. He has waited a long time to see a Voss brought low, and he will not soften simply because you smile prettily at the staff." "I do not smile to win anyone's favor, Margaret," Alira replied evenly. "I smile because bitterness accomplishes nothing, and I refuse to let this house turn me into someone I am not." Margaret studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her sharp eyes, before she left without another word. That evening, during one of the rare dinners shared in silence between husband and wife, Alira decided to test the waters of conversation, curious to understand more about the man she had married. "Your family lost everything because of a ruling my father made," she said carefully, watching Cassian's reaction across the long table. "But I have read through some of the old records in your study, and something about that ruling seems strange to me." Cassian's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Strange in what way?" "The charges against your father involved smuggled goods crossing the border without proper taxation," Alira continued. "But the ledgers I found show inconsistencies in the numbers used to convict him. The amounts recorded by the Crown's investigators do not match trade records from that same period." For a long moment, Cassian said nothing, his expression unreadable. "You have been going through my private records," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of warning. "I have been trying to understand the man I married," Alira replied honestly, "and in doing so, I noticed something that troubled me. If those numbers are wrong, it means your father may have been wrongly convicted, just as I have been." Something flickered across Cassian's face, quick and sharp, gone before she could name it. "You know nothing about what happened to my family," he said coldly. "Do not pretend sympathy you do not feel, simply to soften my resolve toward you." "I am not seeking your sympathy," Alira said, matching his tone. "I am simply pointing out a truth I stumbled upon. Whether you choose to believe it is entirely your decision." She rose from the table before he could respond, leaving her meal unfinished, and made her way back to her chambers with her heart pounding. She had not expected to find anything of consequence within his old records, yet the discrepancies she uncovered nagged at her mind long into the night. If his father's downfall had been built on false evidence, just as her own scandal had been constructed from forged letters, then perhaps the two situations were connected by more than simple coincidence. Perhaps someone else entirely had orchestrated both disasters, using the Voss and Rourke families as pawns in a game neither of them fully understood. The thought unsettled her sleep, filling her dreams with fragmented images of old court gatherings, whispered conversations, and faces she could not quite place. She woke before dawn once more, the rain from days earlier replaced by pale morning sunlight filtering through her window, and resolved to continue her quiet investigation, regardless of how Cassian might react to her curiosity. If there was a connection between their two families' ruin, she intended to find it, brick by brick, ledger by ledger, no matter how long it took, or how coldly her husband treated her along the way. Because if someone else had engineered both tragedies, then perhaps Cassian Rourke was not truly her enemy at all. Perhaps he was simply another victim, blinded by grief and years of misplaced anger, unable to see the true architect of his family's suffering, standing somewhere just beyond his reach. And if that was true, Illyra intended to make him see it, whether he welcomed her help or not. Weeks passed at the Rourke estate, and Illyra learned to move through its halls the way she once moved through the palace, quiet, watchful, and careful never to reveal how much she truly noticed. Cassian remained distant, speaking to her only when required, treating their marriage as a formality to be endured rather than a bond of any meaning. Yet Illyra had not forgotten the strange discrepancies she found in his father's old trade ledgers, and she had no intention of letting the matter rest. She began spending her mornings in the estate's library, a modest room compared to the palace archives she once had access to, but filled nonetheless with old documents, correspondence, and records dating back decades. She told the household staff she simply wished to occupy her time productively, learning the history of her new home. Only Grace seemed to suspect there was more behind her quiet diligence, though the young servant said nothing, bringing tea each morning and lingering just long enough to offer small updates about the household's mood. The Duke received a letter from Lord Hensworth yesterday, Grace mentioned one morning, setting a tray beside Illyra's growing pile of documents. He seemed troubled after reading it, though he said nothing to the staff about its contents. Illyra's fingers paused over an old ledger page. Lord Hensworth, she repeated softly, the same advisor who had presented the forged letters against her in court, who seemed almost pleased at her downfall. Do you know what the letter concerned? No, Your Highness, Grace said, but he locked himself in his study for hours afterward, and Margaret says she has never seen him so quiet. That evening, curiosity overpowering caution, Illyra found herself standing outside Cassian's study, long after the household had gone to sleep. A thin line of candlelight glowed beneath the door, meaning he remained awake, likely still reviewing whatever correspondence had unsettled him. She hesitated, torn between the safety of remaining uninvolved and the pull of understanding more about the man she had married, and the forces working around them both. She knocked softly before she could talk herself out of it. "Enter!" Cassian's voice called, tired and distracted. She stepped inside to find him seated at his desk, a single candle illuminating stacks of parchment and an open letter bearing an unfamiliar wax seal. He looked up, surprise flickering briefly across his face, before his expression hardened into its usual guarded calm. "It is late," he said. "What brings you to my study at this hour?" "Grace mentioned you received troubling news," Illyra said carefully. "I thought perhaps, given the strange connections I found in your father's old ledgers, this might relate to the same matter." Cassian studied her for a long moment, clearly debating whether to share anything at all. Finally, with a tired sigh, he gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit then, since you seem determined to involve yourself regardless of my wishes." Illyra sat, folding her hands in her lap, waiting patiently as he considered his words. "Lord Hensworth wrote to inform me that certain merchants who once testified against my father during his trial have recently come into unexplained wealth," Cassian said finally. "He believes it may be worth investigating, whether they were paid to give false testimony all those years ago." "That aligns with what I found in the ledgers," Illyra said, leaning forward. "The numbers used to convict your father do not match the actual trade records from that period. Someone altered the evidence, Cassian. Someone wanted your family removed from power, just as someone wanted me removed from the palace. You believe these events are connected," Cassian said slowly, watching her with an intensity she had not seen from him before. "I believe it is too great a coincidence that both our families suffered ruin, built upon false evidence," Illyra replied. "And I believe Lord Hensworth's sudden interest in your father's old trial, so soon after presenting forged letters against me, suggests he may know more than he has ever admitted." Cassian leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, clearly wrestling with thoughts he had carried for years. "I have hated the Voss name since I was a boy," he admitted quietly. "I built my entire life around reclaiming what was taken from my family, and I saw your ruin as justice finally served. But if what you say is true, if someone else engineered both our downfalls, then my hatred has been misplaced for a very long time." "I do not ask you to abandon your grief," Illyra said gently. "I only ask you to consider the possibility that we have both been used as pieces in someone else's game, long before either of us understood what was happening." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft crackle of the candle's flame. For the first time since their wedding, Cassian looked at her without coldness, without the guarded resentment that had defined every interaction between them. Instead, he looked at her the way one looks at an unexpected ally, uncertain but curious. "If you are right," he said slowly, "then we have a great deal of work ahead of us, and very few people we can trust to help us uncover the truth." "Then we begin carefully," Elira said, "starting with these merchants Lord Hensworth mentioned. If they were paid to give false testimony, someone must have delivered that payment, and that person may lead us to whoever truly orchestrated both our families' ruin." Over the following days, an unspoken truce settled between them, neither entirely trusting the other, yet both recognizing the value of working together toward a common goal. Cassian arranged quiet meetings with contacts from his years of trade dealings, men who owed him favors and knew how to gather information without drawing unwanted attention. Elira, meanwhile, continued combing through old records, cross-referencing dates, names, and financial transactions that might reveal a pattern hidden beneath the surface of two seemingly unrelated tragedies. Slowly, a picture began forming, fragmented and incomplete, but undeniably present. Several of the merchants who testified against Cassian's father years earlier had received substantial payments shortly before the trial concluded, payments that could not be traced to any legitimate business transaction. Similarly, the seal used to forge Elira's supposed treasonous letters bore a subtle inconsistency, a flaw in the wax pattern that suggested it had been copied from an original, rather than pressed by an authentic royal seal. Someone with access to genuine seals and enough wealth to bribe witnesses, Cassian mused one evening, reviewing their gathered evidence spread across his study table. That narrows the possibilities considerably, though it still leaves several names within the court who might fit such a description. Lord Hensworth had access to royal correspondence and seals as the king's advisor, Elira pointed out, and he was remarkably quick to present evidence against me, almost as though he anticipated the accusation before it was formally announced. "But why would he want your family ruined?" Cassian asked. "The Voss line has held power for generations. What benefit could Hensworth possibly gain from your downfall?" Elira considered the question carefully, her mind working through years of court politics, and whispered rumors she had overheard, but never fully understood. "Perhaps it was never about my family specifically," she said slowly. "Perhaps it was about clearing my path from the throne, removing me as a possible heir, or ensuring my betrothal to Prince Edmund never resulted in an alliance that threatened someone else's ambitions. And my family's ruin created chaos within the trade routes your father once controlled," Cassian added, understanding dawning across his features. "Land and contracts that were quietly redistributed to allies, loyal to Hensworth's own interests." They stared at each other, the weight of their shared discovery settling heavily between them. If their suspicions proved true, Lord Hensworth had spent over a decade quietly manipulating the fates of multiple noble families, using forged evidence and bribed testimony to reshape the kingdom's power structure entirely in his own favor. "We cannot move against him without absolute proof," Cassian said finally. "A man capable of what we suspect will not hesitate to destroy anyone who threatens to expose him." "Then we gather that proof carefully," Elira said, determination hardening her voice. "Piece by piece, until even the king himself cannot ignore what we present." As the candle burned low between them, casting long shadows across the study walls, something had shifted in the space separating Elira and Cassian. The cold hostility that once defined their marriage had not vanished entirely. Old wounds and years of misplaced resentment did not disappear so easily, but a fragile understanding had begun to grow in its place, born from shared purpose and the slow recognition that perhaps they were not enemies after all, but two people wronged by the same hidden hand. Elira rose to leave for the night, pausing at the study door before glancing back at her husband, still seated among his scattered papers, his expression thoughtful in the dim candlelight. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for listening tonight, instead of dismissing me as you have every right to do." Cassian looked up, something unfamiliar softening his sharp features. "Perhaps I was wrong about you, Elira Voss," he said. "Perhaps we were both wrong about each other from the very beginning." She said nothing more, simply nodding, before retreating to her chambers, her heart carrying a strange new weight she did not yet fully understand. Outside her window, The moon hung low over the quiet estate grounds, silent witness to a truce forming slowly between two people, bound together by circumstance, now united by a shared search for truth that neither of them could face alone. An invitation arrived at the estate nearly a month after the wedding, sealed with the crest of Lord Pharaoh, one of the wealthiest nobles in the kingdom, and a man known for hosting lavish gatherings, meant to display his influence. The invitation requested the presence of Duke Rourke and his new Duchess at a formal dinner celebrating the harvest season, an event certain to draw much of the court, including, Illyra suspected, Lord Hensworth himself. Cassian read the invitation twice, before setting it aside with visible reluctance. "We cannot refuse without drawing suspicion," he said. "Lord Pharaoh holds considerable sway among the merchant houses, and an insult to him now would only complicate matters. We cannot yet afford to complicate." "Then we attend," Illyra said simply. "And we present exactly the picture the court expects. A duke who has claimed his prize, and a duchess who has accepted her fate quietly." "Can you manage such a performance?" Cassian asked, studying her carefully. Illyra allowed herself a small, sharp smile. "Duke Rourke, I spent my entire life performing for a court that judged my every movement. I assure you, pretending to be your devoted wife, for a single evening, will hardly test my abilities." The evening of the gathering arrived with a chill in the air that hinted at the coming autumn. Illyra dressed in a deep blue gown that Cassian had, somewhat surprisingly, ordered for the occasion, delivered without explanation, 2 days earlier, by a tailor from the city. It fit her perfectly, elegant without being extravagant, a careful balance that suggested someone had considered exactly how she should appear before the court that once discarded her. When she descended the stairs to meet him before their departure, Cassian's expression flickered with something unreadable as his eyes moved over her. He said nothing about the gown, offering only a stiff nod before escorting her to the waiting carriage, but Illyra noticed his gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary. Lord Pharaoh's estate glittered with candlelight and music when they arrived, the great hall filled with nobles who had once bowed to Illyra as their princess, and now watched her with barely concealed curiosity as she entered on Cassian's arm. Whispers followed them through the crowd, though Illyra kept her expression composed, her chin lifted with the same quiet dignity she had carried since childhood. The disgraced princess, married to the man whose family she ruined, someone murmured nearby, not bothering to lower their voice enough to escape her hearing. "I wonder if the Duke sleeps with a blade nearby, given what her family is capable of." Illyra's fingers tightened slightly around Cassian's arm, though she said nothing, refusing to give the gossiping nobles the satisfaction of a reaction. Beside her, she felt Cassian stiffen as well, his jaw tightening at the comment. "Ignore them," he murmured, low enough for only her to hear. "They know nothing of what has passed between us." The unexpected defense in his voice surprised her, though she kept her composure, offering only a small nod in response as they continued into the hall. Dinner proceeded with the usual formalities. Course after course served amid polite conversation that carried an undercurrent of sharp curiosity directed at the newly married couple. Illyra navigated the evening with practiced grace, answering questions about her new life with careful diplomacy, deflecting anything too pointed, with the same skill she had once used to survive years of court scrutiny. It was during the evening's dancing that Lord Hensworth finally approached them, his expression carrying the same false warmth Illyra remembered from the day he presented forged evidence against her in court. "Duke Rourke," Hensworth said smoothly, "and the new Duchess. How fitting that you both look so well, given the circumstances that brought your union into being." "Lord Hensworth," Cassian said, his tone carefully neutral. "I trust the king is in good health." Quite well," Hensworth replied, his sharp eyes shifting toward Illyra. "And you, Duchess? How do you find life beyond the palace walls? I imagine it must be quite an adjustment, coming from such grandeur, to a house with far more modest means." The insult was thinly veiled, but Illyra met it with an easy smile. "I find simplicity suits me rather well, Lord Hensworth. There is a certain clarity in leaving behind a court so filled with hidden agendas and whispered lies. I find I sleep more peacefully these days than I ever did within the palace." Something flickered behind Hensworth's eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual practiced smile. "How fortunate for you," he said, "though I do hope you have found peace with the truth of your circumstances, whatever that truth may be. The truth has a way of revealing itself eventually." Elira replied evenly, regardless of how carefully it has been buried. Hensworth's smile did not waver, but Elira noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, a flicker of unease that confirmed everything she had suspected. He excused himself shortly after, moving through the crowd to greet other guests, though Elira felt his gaze return to her more than once throughout the remainder of the evening. "You handled that well," Cassian murmured, once Hensworth had moved out of earshot, "though I noticed you chose your words rather carefully." "He knows something is being uncovered," Elira said quietly. "Whether he suspects us specifically, or simply senses danger in the wind, I cannot say. But we must be more careful now than ever." As the evening progressed toward its final hours, the orchestra began a slow, formal dance, and tradition dictated that Cassian lead his wife onto the floor for at least one performance before their peers. Elira felt a flutter of nervousness as he extended his hand, an unfamiliar sensation, given how thoroughly she had convinced herself their marriage held no room for such feelings. His hand was warm against hers as they moved together through the steps, far more graceful than she had expected from a man known primarily for his sharp business dealings rather than courtly refinement. Around them, the watching nobles seemed to soften slightly, whispered conversations shifting from cruel speculation to something closer to grudging admiration at the picture they presented. "You dance well, Duke Rourke," Elira said softly as they turned through the steps. "My mother insisted upon it, long before everything fell apart," Cassian replied, his voice quieter than usual. "She believed a gentleman should never embarrass himself on a dance floor, regardless of what troubles waited beyond it. She sounds as though she was a wise woman." "She was," Cassian said, something wistful passing briefly across his features. "I have not danced since her passing. Not until tonight." The admission hung between them, unexpected, and strangely intimate amid the glittering chaos of the ballroom. Elira found herself studying his face more closely, searching for the boy who once learned to dance under his mother's careful guidance, buried somewhere beneath the hardened exterior he had built to survive his family's ruin. "Thank you for sharing that with me," she said quietly. Cassian's eyes met hers, something warmer than she had seen from him before, flickering briefly across his expression, before he composed himself once more. "Do not grow accustomed to such honesty, Duchess," he said, though his voice lacked its usual sharp edge. "I am still the man who married you, for reasons that had nothing to do with affection." "Perhaps," Elira replied, matching his tone with a small, knowing smile, "though I find myself wondering if that man is beginning to change, whether he wishes to admit it or not." The dance ended before he could respond, and they returned to the edges of the hall as the evening drew toward its close. Throughout the carriage ride home, neither of them spoke much, though Elira noticed Cassian glancing toward her more than once, his expression thoughtful in the dim light filtering through the carriage windows. When they arrived back at the estate, he escorted her to the base of the staircase leading toward her chambers, pausing before releasing her arm. "You surprised me tonight," he said quietly. "I expected you to struggle beneath the court's scrutiny, yet you handled every challenge with more grace than I anticipated." "I have survived worse than a room full of whispering nobles, Cassian," Elira said, using his given name for the first time since their wedding. Something flickered across his face at the sound of it, though he said nothing to correct her. "Good night, Elira," he said finally, his voice carrying an unfamiliar gentleness. "Good night," she replied, watching him turn and disappear down the hall, toward his own chambers, before she made her way upstairs, her thoughts a tangled mixture of triumph over the evening's performance, and confusion at the growing warmth she could no longer deny feeling toward the man she had married under such bitter circumstances. Whatever waited ahead in their search for truth against Lord Hensworth, Elira realized she no longer faced it entirely alone. And for the first time since her world had crumbled beneath forged letters and false accusations, that realization brought her something close to comfort. A week after Lord Pharaoh's gathering, Cassian received a summons to appear before the royal court regarding a trade dispute involving one of his shipping contracts. He explained the matter to Elira over breakfast, his brow furrowed with concern he tried to mask beneath practiced calm. "A merchant named Oswin Blake claims I breached a contract regarding grain shipments from the northern provinces," Cassian said, setting down a letter bearing the court's official seal. "The claim is baseless. I have never dealt with a merchant by that name in all my years of trade. Yet the court has summoned me to answer for it regardless." Illyra frowned, something uneasy settling in her stomach. Baseless claims brought before the court, summoning you away from the estate, at precisely the moment we have begun uncovering evidence against Hensworth. That is no coincidence, Cassian. You believe this is a trap, he said, understanding dawning across his features. I believe someone wants you distracted, or perhaps discredited before the court, weakening your position before you can present any evidence against him, Illyra replied. We must proceed carefully. Cassian traveled to the capital 2 days later, leaving Illyra behind at the estate with strict instructions to remain cautious and avoid drawing unnecessary attention during his absence. She agreed reluctantly, though unease continued gnawing at her throughout his absence, a persistent feeling that something had been set into motion beyond what either of them yet understood. Her instincts proved correct. On the 3rd day of his absence, a rider arrived at the estate bearing urgent news from one of Cassian's trusted merchant contacts, a quiet man named Nathaniel Cole who had been assisting them in tracing the bribed witnesses from years earlier. The Duke has been summoned before a tribunal. Not simply a trade dispute as he believed, Nathaniel explained breathlessly to Illyra in the estate's entrance hall. Lord Hensworth has quietly gathered several merchants, willing to testify that the Duke engaged in smuggling operations along the northern border, similar to the very charges that ruined his father years ago. If the tribunal believes these claims, the Duke could lose his title and his freedom before nightfall. Illyra's blood ran cold. This is Hensworth's doing. He knows we suspect him, and he intends to remove Cassian before we can present any evidence against him. What would you have me do, Your Highness? Nathaniel asked. Gather every document we have collected these past weeks, Illyra said, her mind already racing through possibilities. The discrepancies in the original trial ledgers, the unexplained wealth among the merchants who testified against his father, everything. I am traveling to the capital myself. Cassian cannot face this tribunal without the evidence that proves this pattern of false accusations stretches back over a decade. Nathaniel hesitated. The journey is not without danger, Your Highness, particularly if Hensworth suspects you carry evidence against him. Then we travel quickly and quietly, Illyra said firmly. I did not survive my own false accusation, only to watch my husband fall to the very same scheme, without doing everything within my power to stop it. They departed within the hour, traveling through back roads Nathaniel knew well from his years of trade dealings, avoiding the main routes where Hensworth's allies might be watching for exactly this kind of movement. Illyra's heart pounded throughout the journey. Fear for Cassian's fate, mixing with a fierce determination she had not expected to feel so strongly on his behalf. They arrived at the capital as the tribunal proceedings were already underway, the grand hall filled with nobles, eager to witness another scandal unfold before them. Illyra pushed through the crowd gathered outside the chamber doors, ignoring the startled murmurs that followed her sudden appearance. Inside, she found Cassian standing before a panel of judges, his expression composed despite the weight of accusations being leveled against him by a merchant she did not recognize, presumably the fabricated Oswin Blake. Lord Hensworth stood nearby, his expression carefully arranged into concerned neutrality, though Illyra recognized the satisfaction hidden beneath his practiced mask. Duke Rourke stands accused of smuggling operations along the northern border, evidence eerily similar to charges brought against his father many years ago, the presiding judge announced. Given this troubling pattern, the tribunal must consider whether such behavior runs within the family line itself. I have evidence that disproves not only these current charges, but the charges brought against Duke Rourke's father over a decade ago, Illyra called out, striding into the chamber despite the startled gasps that followed her interruption. Duchess Rourke, the judge said, clearly caught off guard by her sudden arrival. This is highly irregular. Forgive the interruption, but justice should never be delayed for the sake of formality, Illyra said, approaching the panel with the same confident bearing she had once carried as a princess of the realm. She gestured for Nathaniel to bring forward the documents they had gathered. These records prove that the testimony used to convict Cassian Rourke's father years ago was purchased through substantial, unexplained payments to the very merchants who testified against him. The same pattern appears to be repeating here today. Murmurs rippled through the gathered nobles as the judges examined the documents Illyra presented, comparing dates, signatures, and financial records that painted an unmistakable picture of manipulation, stretching back over a decade. Lord Hensworth stepped forward, his composure beginning to crack at the edges. "These documents prove nothing beyond coincidental financial transactions," he said, though his voice carried a note of strain that had not been present moments earlier. "The Duchess clearly seeks to protect her husband through whatever means available, regardless of the truth. Then perhaps the tribunal should question the merchant currently testifying against my husband," Illyra said, turning toward the man identified as Oswin Blake, who shifted uncomfortably under the sudden attention. Perhaps he might explain the substantial payment he received into his account 3 weeks ago, shortly before this tribunal was convened. The merchant's face paled visibly, his eyes darting toward Hensworth, before he stammered out a weak denial that convinced no one in the chamber. The judges exchanged uneasy glances, clearly recognizing the unraveling deception unfolding before them. "This tribunal will recess, while these new claims are properly investigated," the presiding judge announced finally. "Duke Rourke, you are released from custody, pending further inquiry into these serious allegations regarding manipulated testimony." Cassian's shoulders visibly relaxed, though his eyes remained fixed on Illyra, with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with something deeper she could not fully name. As the chamber began emptying, he crossed quickly toward her, taking her hands in his without hesitation. "You came for me," he said quietly, disbelief coloring his voice. "I could not stand by and watch you fall to the same scheme that ruined both our families," Illyra replied, her heart pounding from the intensity of the moment. "Whatever else stands between us, Cassian, I refuse to let Hensworth destroy what remains of our lives without a fight." Something shifted in his expression, raw and unguarded, in a way she had never witnessed from him before. "I do not know how to thank you properly for what you have done today," he said. "Then simply promise me, we will finish what we started," Illyra said. "Hensworth grows desperate, which means he grows dangerous. We must move quickly now, before he finds another way to strike against us." Cassian nodded, his grip tightening gently around her hands. "Together then," he said. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." The journey back to the estate passed in comfortable silence, exhaustion from the day's events settling heavily over them both. Yet beneath the exhaustion, Illyra felt something new, blooming quietly within her chest, a warmth she had not expected to feel toward the man who had once married her, purely from spite. Glancing toward him in the dim carriage light, she found him already watching her, his expression soft, in a way that made her breath catch unexpectedly. Neither of them spoke of it, not yet, but something had irrevocably changed between them, within the chaos of that tribunal chamber. A bond forged not from bitterness or revenge, but from loyalty freely given and gratefully received. In the days following the tribunal, the estate settled into a different rhythm entirely. Cassian no longer retreated into cold formality after their conversations, and Illyra found herself seeking his company more often than strict necessity required. Yet beneath this newfound ease, the shadow of Lord Hensworth's schemes still loomed heavily, unresolved and growing more dangerous with each passing day. One evening, as autumn rain fell steadily against the estate windows, Cassian invited Illyra into his study, a stack of old family letters spread across his desk that he had apparently spent the afternoon reviewing. "I want you to understand everything," he said as she settled into the chair across from him. "Not simply the ledgers and financial records we have already examined, but the full history of what happened to my family, so you understand exactly what we are fighting against." Illyra nodded, sensing the vulnerability in his offer, and listened carefully as he began recounting memories he had clearly kept buried for years. "My father was not always a cautious man," Cassian said quietly. "He trusted easily, perhaps too easily, believing that honest dealings would always be met with honest treatment in return. Lord Hensworth was a younger advisor then, ambitious and eager to prove himself within the court. He approached my father with an opportunity, a trade partnership involving northern grain shipments that promised substantial profit for both parties. And the partnership went wrong, Illyra guessed. Terribly wrong, Cassian confirmed. Shipments began disappearing, blamed on smugglers operating along the border. My father was accused of orchestrating the thefts himself, using the partnership as cover to sell goods illegally without paying proper taxation. He swore his innocence until his final days. But the evidence presented against him, forged records and bribed witnesses, proved impossible to overcome. Just as it proved impossible for me, Illyra murmured. Exactly the same, Cassian said, his voice tightening with old grief. I was 12 years old when they stripped my family of our lands and titles. I watched my father grow smaller with each passing year afterward, broken by an injustice he could never prove, until his heart finally gave out, beneath the weight of it all. My mother followed only 2 years later, though I have always believed grief claimed her long before any illness did. Elira reached across the desk, gently covering his hand with her own. I am so sorry, Cassian. No child should watch their family destroyed by lies they cannot fight against. I built everything afterward from anger, Cassian admitted, his eyes meeting hers with rare vulnerability. Every trade deal, every calculated risk, every ounce of wealth I accumulated, was meant to prove that the Rourke name could rise again, regardless of what the court had taken from us. When your family's scandal broke, I saw an opportunity for a different kind of justice, forcing the Voss name to kneel before mine, the way I believed your family once forced mine to kneel. And now? Elira asked softly. Now I understand that we were both simply pieces in Hensworth's design, Cassian said. My anger was never truly aimed at you, Elira. It was aimed at a system that allowed a man like him to destroy families for his own ambition, while hiding behind positions of trust and authority. The confession hung between them, raw and honest, in a way neither of them had allowed themselves to be since their wedding day. Elira studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of the cold, calculating man who had once told her their marriage meant nothing beyond appearances. Thank you for trusting me with this, she said quietly. I know it could not have been easy to share. You have earned far more than my trust, Elira, Cassian replied, his voice low and unexpectedly gentle. You risked your own safety traveling to the capital, presenting evidence before a tribunal that could have easily turned against you as well. I do not know many people who would have done the same for a husband who once treated them so coldly. Perhaps I saw something worth fighting for, Elira said, her heart pounding at the intensity building between them, even beneath the coldness, Cassian. Perhaps I always suspected there was more to you than the revenge you initially sought. They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, the rain continuing its steady rhythm against the windows, the candle between them burning low as the evening stretched onward. Finally, Cassian rose from his desk, moving toward the window to look out at the darkened gardens beyond. There is something else I discovered today, while reviewing these old letters, he said, his voice carrying a note of renewed urgency. A name I had forgotten until now, a witness who testified against my father, but later vanished from the capital entirely, rumored to have fled north after receiving a substantial payment. Do you know where he went? Elira asked, rising to join him at the window. I believe I do, Cassian said. A small fishing village along the northern coast, according to old correspondence I found among my father's belongings. If this witness still lives, and if he can be convinced to speak honestly about what truly happened all those years ago, his testimony could prove decisive against Hensworth. Then we must find him, Elira said firmly. Whatever risk that journey carries, it is worth taking, if it means finally exposing the truth. Cassian turned to face her fully, something warm and unguarded passing across his features in the dim candlelight. You continue to surprise me, Elira Voss, he said softly. I married you believing I understood exactly what our union would mean, a cold arrangement built on old grievances and calculated humiliation. I never imagined I would find in you someone willing to risk everything alongside me, nor did I imagine how deeply I would come to value your presence in my life. Elira's breath caught at the unexpected tenderness in his words, her heart pounding as she searched his face for any hint of insincerity, and found none. I never imagined finding anything beyond cold formality within these walls either, she admitted quietly. Yet here we stand, planning to face danger together, trusting each other with truths neither of us has shared with anyone else. For a moment, the space between them seemed to shrink, charged with something neither of them had acknowledged aloud until this quiet evening in his study. Then Cassian stepped back slightly, clearing his throat as though remembering himself. We should rest, he said, though his voice carried reluctance. The journey north will require careful planning, and we cannot afford mistakes, given how closely Hensworth now watches our movements. Of course, Elira agreed, though something within her ached faintly at the sudden distance between them. As she made her way back toward her chambers that night, her thoughts remained fixed on the vulnerability Cassian had shown her, the grief he had carried silently for so many years, and the warmth that had grown steadily between them, despite the bitter circumstances that first bound them together. Whatever waited ahead on their journey north, Elira realized she no longer feared facing it, not with Cassian standing beside her, no longer as an enemy bound by duty, but as someone whose presence had slowly become far more precious than she had ever expected to allow. The journey north began at dawn. Cassian and Elira traveling in a modest carriage, meant to avoid drawing attention, accompanied only by Nathaniel and a small escort of trusted guards loyal to the Rourke household. The countryside grew wilder and colder as they moved further from the capital, rolling hills giving way to rugged coastline dotted with small fishing villages that seemed untouched by the political turmoil consuming the court. The village should be another day's travel from here, Nathaniel said, consulting an old map spread across his knees as the carriage rattled along the uneven coastal road. According to the correspondence we found, the witness settled somewhere near the shore, living under a different name to avoid recognition. Elira watched the passing scenery, gray waves crashing against distant cliffs, gulls circling overhead against a heavy sky. There was a stark beauty to this wild coastline, so different from the manicured gardens and polished halls she had known her entire life within the palace, and later the Rourke estate. "You seem thoughtful," Cassian observed, watching her from across the carriage. "I am simply appreciating how different the world looks, beyond the walls I once considered my entire existence," Elira replied. "Growing up within the palace, I believed the court's politics represented the whole of what mattered in this kingdom. Yet here, along this wild coast, ordinary people live their lives entirely removed from Hensworth's schemes, unaware of how close their own fates might have come to being shaped by his ambitions. Perhaps that is precisely why men like Hensworth succeed for so long," Cassian said thoughtfully. "Because those with the power to stop them remain too consumed by their own court politics to notice the damage being done, while those who might notice lack the influence to intervene. Then perhaps that is exactly why we must succeed in stopping him," Elira said firmly. "Not simply to reclaim what he has stolen from our families, but to ensure no other family suffers the same fate through his manipulation." They stopped that evening at a small inn, perched along the cliffs, overlooking the sea, the innkeeper offering simple but warm hospitality, entirely unaware of the identities of his noble guests. Over a modest dinner of fresh fish and bread, Cassian and Elira found themselves talking long into the evening, conversations drifting easily between practical planning for their approaching search and quieter, more personal topics neither of them had shared before. "Tell me something about your childhood," Cassian said at one point, watching her carefully across the small table. "Something beyond the court politics and formal lessons, I imagine consumed most of your days as a princess." Elira considered the question for a long moment, memories surfacing that she had not revisited in years. "I used to sneak away from my lessons whenever possible, to visit the palace stables," she said, a small smile touching her lips at the memory. "There was an old stable master named Edmund, not the prince, a different Edmund entirely, who taught me to ride long before my formal riding instructors ever arrived. He used to tell me stories about the wild horses that once roamed the northern plains before they were tamed for the royal stables." "You have never mentioned this before," Cassian said, clearly delighted by this unexpected glimpse into her past. "There was little reason to mention it, given the circumstances of our marriage," Elira replied, "though I suppose there is little harm in sharing such memories now, given everything else we have shared these past weeks." "I would like to hear more," Cassian said quietly, "if you are willing to share it." Something in his tone, gentle and genuinely curious, encouraged Elira to continue, and she found herself recounting stories from her childhood she had not spoken of in years, moments of quiet joy hidden beneath the formal expectations of palace life. Cassian listened intently, occasionally sharing memories of his own childhood before his family's fall from grace, moments of warmth and laughter that had been buried beneath years of grief and calculated ambition. As the evening stretched onward, Elira realized she had not laughed so freely and longer than she could remember, the weight of scandal and political scheming momentarily forgotten in the comfortable warmth of shared conversation. Watching Cassian across the table, his usual guarded expression softened by genuine amusement at something she had said, she felt her heart shift in a way that both thrilled and unsettled her. Later that night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion of travel, Elira wandered down to the inn's small common room, finding Cassian already seated near the dying fire, staring thoughtfully into the flames. "Could not sleep either?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. Too many thoughts, Cassian admitted. About tomorrow. About what we might find. About everything that has changed between us these past weeks. Do you regret it? Alira asked quietly. The changes, I mean. Cassian turned to look at her, firelight casting warm shadows across his features, softening the sharp lines that had once seemed so cold and calculating. I regret many things about how our marriage began, he said honestly. The cruelty I showed you, the assumptions I made about who you were, before ever truly knowing you. But I do not regret where we have arrived, Alira. Not for a single moment. Her breath caught at the sincerity in his voice, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the crackling fire filling the comfortable silence between them. Cassian reached out slowly, taking her hand in his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles in a gesture that felt far more intimate than anything they had shared before. I find myself thinking of you far more than I ever anticipated, he admitted quietly, wondering what you are doing throughout the day, seeking excuses to speak with you, treasuring conversations I once believed I would never welcome from a Voss. I feel the same, Alira whispered, her heart pounding at the vulnerability of the admission, though I confess it frightens me somewhat, given how our story began. It frightens me as well, Cassian said, his voice rough with emotion. But I find I would rather face that fear than return to the cold distance we once maintained between us. They sat together by the dying fire long into the night, hands intertwined, speaking softly of hopes and fears neither of them had voiced to another living soul. Whatever waited for them the following day in their search for the missing witness, Alira realized that something precious had solidified between them during this quiet, unexpected evening. A bond, built not from duty or revenge, but from genuine understanding and a tenderness neither of them had believed possible when they first exchanged their cold, distant vows. As dawn began creeping over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink, Cassian finally rose, gently helping Alira to her feet as well. We should rest before our journey continues, he said softly, though his eyes lingered on her face, with an expression that suggested he was equally reluctant to end their quiet time together. Yes, Alira agreed softly, though neither of them moved immediately toward the stairs leading to their separate chambers. For a brief moment, standing close together in the fading firelight, Alira wondered if he might close the remaining distance between them entirely. But Cassian simply pressed a gentle kiss to the back of her hand, an old-fashioned gesture that nonetheless carried a weight of unspoken promise, before escorting her toward the stairs and bidding her a quiet good night. Alone in her small chamber moments later, Alira pressed her fingers gently against the spot where his lips had touched her hand, her heart racing with feelings she could no longer deny nor fully understand. Whatever complications still lay ahead in their fight against Hensworth, she realized that her feelings toward Cassian Rourke had grown into something far deeper and more precious than either of them had ever anticipated when their bitter marriage first began. They reached the fishing village by midday, a small cluster of cottages huddled against the cliffs, weathered fishing boats bobbing gently in the sheltered harbor below. Nathaniel led them through narrow streets lined with modest homes, asking quiet questions of villagers they passed, careful not to draw undue attention to their search. Eventually, an elderly fisherman mending nets near the harbor's edge directed them toward a small cottage set slightly apart from the others, overlooking the sea from a rocky outcrop. "You'll be looking for old Barnaby then," the fisherman said, eyeing them curiously. "Keeps to himself mostly, though he's lived here longer than most can remember. Arrived one winter with nothing but the clothes on his back and enough coin to buy that cottage outright." Alira exchanged a meaningful glance with Cassian. A man arriving suddenly with unexplained wealth matched exactly the pattern they had uncovered among the bribed witnesses from years earlier. They approached the cottage cautiously, Cassian knocking firmly on the weathered door. After a long moment, it creaked open to reveal an elderly man with weathered features and wary eyes, studying them with obvious suspicion. "We mean you no harm," Alira said gently, sensing the man's fear before he had spoken a single word. "We simply wish to ask about events from many years ago concerning a trial involving Duke Rourke's father." The old man's face paled visibly at the mention of the name, and for a moment, Alira feared he might slam the door shut entirely. Instead, he stepped back silently, gesturing for them to enter, his hands trembling slightly as he closed the door behind them. "I wondered if this day might come eventually," he said quietly, settling into a worn chair beside a small hearth. I am Barnaby now, though once, many years ago, I was known by a different name entirely. We know about the payment you received before testifying against my father, Cassian said, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotion clearly building within him. We know the testimony was false. Barnaby's shoulders sagged, years of buried guilt visibly weighing upon him. I have carried that guilt every single day since I fled the capital, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Lord Hensworth approached me quietly, offering more coin than I could have earned honestly in a lifetime of trade, simply to testify that I had witnessed your father engaging in smuggling operations along the border. I never witnessed any such thing, I lied, and an honest man lost everything because of my greed. Will you testify to this truth now? Elira asked gently. Before the royal tribunal, exposing Hensworth's manipulation once and for all. Fear flickered across Barnaby's weathered features. Hensworth is a powerful man, with allies throughout the court. If I testify against him, my life would be forfeit the moment I stepped foot in the capital. We will ensure your protection, Cassian said firmly. You have my word as Duke Rourke, that no harm will come to you for speaking the truth. Barnaby studied them both for a long, considering moment, old guilt warring visibly with lingering fear. Finally, he nodded slowly. I am an old man now, with little left to lose beyond the years I have remaining. Perhaps it is time I finally corrected the wrong I committed so long ago, regardless of what danger that truth might bring. They spent the remainder of the day carefully documenting Barnaby's testimony, along with additional details he provided about other witnesses who had similarly been bribed to testify falsely, painting an increasingly damning picture of Hensworth's decade-long scheme of manipulation and corruption. As evening fell, they made arrangements to bring Barnaby safely back toward the capital, understanding that his testimony alone might finally provide the undeniable proof needed to expose Hensworth entirely. That night, as they prepared for the journey ahead, Elira found herself standing alone on the cliffside, overlooking the darkened sea, the weight of everything they had uncovered pressing heavily upon her thoughts. Footsteps approached quietly behind her, and she did not need to turn to know Cassian had joined her. We are close now, he said softly, standing beside her at the cliff's edge. Closer than I ever believed possible when we first began this search. I keep thinking of everything Hensworth has taken, Elira said quietly, not just from our families, but from Barnaby as well, forced to abandon his entire life out of guilt and fear. How many others has he destroyed throughout the years, simply to secure his own position and wealth? We cannot undo the damage already done, Cassian said gently, but we can ensure he answers for it, and that no other family suffers the same fate in the future. Elira turned to face him, moonlight illuminating his features with a soft silver glow. Thank you for trusting me throughout this journey, she said, for allowing me to stand beside you as an equal, rather than simply a duty you were forced to endure. You have never been simply a duty, Elira, Cassian said, his voice low and filled with quiet intensity. Not for a very long time now. I find myself grateful every single day that circumstances brought you into my life, however bitterly our story began. The distance between them seemed to shrink once more, the same charged tension from their evening by the inn's fireplace returning with even greater intensity beneath the star-filled sky. Cassian reached up slowly, brushing a strand of hair away from her face, his fingers lingering gently against her cheek. Elira, he said softly, her name carrying a weight of unspoken longing. I find myself wanting things I never believed I would want again, particularly not with someone I once viewed as my enemy. What do you want, Cassian? Elira whispered, her heart pounding, as she searched his face in the moonlight. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, something raw and vulnerable passing across his features, before he stepped back slightly, running a hand through his hair, with visible restraint. Forgive me, he said, his voice rough. This is neither the time nor place for such thoughts, given everything still ahead of us. Elira felt a flicker of disappointment, though she understood the wisdom in his restraint. Perhaps you are right, she said softly. There will be time enough for such conversations, once Hensworth has finally been dealt with. Yes, Cassian agreed, though his eyes lingered on her, with an intensity that suggested his restraint had cost him considerable effort. Once this is finished, Elira, I intend to speak with you honestly, about everything I have come to feel. But first, we must ensure justice is finally served, for both our families, and for every other soul Hensworth has wronged throughout his years of quiet manipulation. They returned to the cottage together, preparing for the journey back toward the capital that would begin at first light, carrying with them not only the testimony that might finally expose Hensworth's corruption, but also an unspoken promise of something deeper, waiting to be explored once their fight for justice had reached its conclusion. The journey back toward the capital carried a different weight than their travel north had, urgency now mixing with the fragile tenderness that had grown between Cassian and Alira along the wild coastal cliffs. Barnaby traveled with them, hidden carefully within their carriage, understanding the danger his testimony represented to Hensworth's carefully constructed reputation. They had traveled only 2 days when Nathaniel, riding ahead to scout the road, returned with troubling news. "There are riders positioned along the main route toward the capital," he reported, dismounting quickly beside their carriage. "I do not recognize their colors, but their presence seems deliberate, watching the road rather than simply traveling upon it." "Hensworth suspects we may be returning with new evidence," Cassian said grimly. "He must have allies watching every route toward the capital, hoping to intercept us before we can present Barnaby's testimony." "Then we take a different path," Alira said firmly. "Whatever backroads Nathaniel used to reach the coast originally, we use those same routes in reverse, avoiding the main roads entirely." They altered their course immediately, taking narrower, less traveled paths that added considerable time to their journey, but offered greater safety from Hensworth's watching allies. Despite the added danger and uncertainty, Alira found a strange calm settling over her, born from the knowledge that whatever waited ahead, she no longer faced it entirely alone. On the third night of their altered journey, as they made camp within a small forest clearing, rather than risk another inn along their path, Cassian approached Alira as she sat near their modest campfire, staring thoughtfully into the flickering flames. "You seem troubled," he observed, settling beside her. "I keep wondering what Hensworth will do once he realizes we have Barnaby's testimony," Alira admitted. "A man capable of manipulating trials and bribing witnesses for over a decade will not simply accept defeat quietly. He will fight to protect everything he has built, regardless of the cost to others." "Then we ensure we are prepared for whatever he attempts," Cassian said firmly. "We have gathered enough evidence now that even his considerable influence cannot easily dismiss the truth. The tribunal that recently questioned my own innocence will be forced to consider Barnaby's testimony, alongside everything else we have uncovered." Alira nodded, though uncertainty still lingered within her thoughts. Sensing her continued unease, Cassian reached over gently, taking her hand in his, the same tender gesture from their evening by the coastal inn. "Whatever happens, Alira," he said quietly, "I want you to know that these past weeks, searching for truth alongside you, have meant more to me than I ever anticipated when this journey began. I no longer see you as the daughter of a family that wronged mine. I see you as someone I have come to deeply respect, and someone whose presence in my life has become far more precious than I ever imagined possible." Alira's breath caught at the sincerity in his voice, her heart pounding as she turned to face him fully in the firelight. "I feel exactly the same, Cassian," she whispered. "What began as a marriage, built from bitterness and revenge, has become something I treasure deeply, something I never expected to find again after everything the scandal took from me." Their eyes met, the same charged tension from the cliffside returning, with even greater intensity, now that both of them had spoken their feelings so openly. Cassian's gaze dropped briefly to her lips, before returning to her eyes, silent question passing between them that neither dared voice aloud. Not yet, not with so much uncertainty still hanging over their approaching confrontation with Hensworth. "Once this is finished," Cassian said softly, echoing his earlier promise from the coastal cliffs, "I intend to court you properly, Alira, the way I should have from the very beginning, rather than the cold arrangement that first brought us together." "I would like that very much," Alira replied, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time, in what felt like ages. They remained by the fire long into the night, speaking softly of hopes for whatever future might await them once justice had finally been served. The growing warmth between them, a stark contrast to the danger and uncertainty still surrounding their journey. They reached the capital 3 days later, arriving just as word spread through the court that the tribunal investigating Cassian's earlier smuggling accusations had reconvened to consider new evidence. Elira understood immediately that Hensworth must have grown desperate, attempting to rush the proceedings toward a conclusion before they could present Barnaby's testimony. They arrived at the tribunal chamber just as the proceedings began, Barnaby carefully hidden beneath a simple traveling cloak until the precise moment his testimony would carry the greatest impact. Lord Hensworth stood near the judges' panel, his expression carrying forced confidence that could not entirely mask the tension visible beneath his composed exterior. "Duke Rourke, Duchess Voss," Hensworth said coolly as they entered, deliberately using her maiden name rather than her married title, a small cruelty meant to unsettle her before the gathered court. "I trust your journey these past days proved productive." "Extremely productive, Lord Hensworth," Elira replied evenly, refusing to let his deliberate insult shake her composure. "We have gathered testimony that I believe will interest this tribunal a great deal." Confusion flickered briefly across several judges' faces, though Hensworth's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly, clearly sensing the danger her words represented. "The tribunal has already reviewed sufficient evidence regarding these current smuggling charges," Hensworth said quickly. "I see no need for further delay in reaching a verdict. Perhaps the tribunal should hear from a witness who testified against Duke Rourke's father over a decade ago," Elira said, stepping forward with quiet authority. "A witness who has finally chosen to correct the false testimony he once gave under considerable financial pressure." Gasps rippled through the assembled court as Nathaniel guided Barnaby forward, the old fisherman's weathered face showing visible nervousness despite his evident determination to finally speak the truth. Hensworth's composure cracked visibly at the sight of him, recognition and dawning panic flickering across his features before he quickly masked it with practiced indifference. "I do not know this man," Hensworth said, though his voice carried a thin edge of desperation that had not been present moments earlier. "You know him quite well, Lord Hensworth," Barnaby said, his voice trembling slightly, but growing stronger with each word. "You approached me personally many years ago, offering substantial payment in exchange for false testimony against Duke Rourke's father. I have carried the guilt of that lie for over a decade, and I am finally prepared to speak the truth before this tribunal, regardless of what consequences that truth may bring upon me." The chamber erupted into stunned murmurs as Barnaby continued his testimony, detailing the exact payment he received, the specific instructions Hensworth had given him regarding what false claims to make, and his subsequent flight from the capital out of guilt and fear. The judges listened with growing alarm, exchanging troubled glances as the weight of his testimony settled over the chamber. "This is preposterous," Hensworth said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "An old man's fabricated story, likely paid for by Duke Rourke himself to escape legitimate charges against his own conduct." "We have additional evidence beyond this testimony alone," Cassian said, stepping forward beside Elira, his voice carrying steady authority, despite the tension visible in his tightened jaw. "Financial records proving unexplained wealth among multiple witnesses who testified against my father, alongside evidence regarding forged royal seals used to fabricate treasonous letters against my wife. A pattern of manipulation stretching back over a decade, Lord Hensworth, all pointing toward a single architect, determined to reshape this kingdom's power structure for his own personal gain." The presiding judge's expression had grown increasingly grave throughout these revelations, and he raised a hand finally to silence the growing chaos within the chamber. "Given the serious nature of these accusations, this tribunal will suspend current proceedings against Duke Rourke immediately, pending a thorough investigation into Lord Hensworth's conduct over the past decade." Hensworth's composure finally shattered entirely, his eyes darting toward the chamber's exits, as though calculating whether escape remained possible. Guards moved swiftly to prevent any such attempt, closing in around him as the full weight of his exposed corruption settled visibly upon his features. "You cannot prove any of this," he snarled, all pretense of calm authority abandoned entirely. "Whatever evidence you believe you have gathered means nothing without absolute proof, connecting me directly to these schemes." "We have more evidence than you realize, Lord Hensworth," Elira said calmly, meeting his furious gaze without flinching. "Enough to ensure that every family you have wronged throughout these years finally receives the justice they have long deserved." As guards moved to formally detain Hensworth, pending further investigation, Elira felt Cassian's hand find hers, his fingers intertwining with her own, in a gesture of quiet triumph and shared relief. Whatever challenges still remained before Hensworth's guilt could be fully proven and justice fully restored, Elira understood that the most difficult battle had finally been won, and she had faced it not alone, but alongside a man who had become far more precious to her than she ever could have imagined when their bitter marriage first began. The weeks following Hensworth's detainment brought a flurry of investigation throughout the court, royal officials combing through years of records, correspondence, and financial transactions that gradually revealed the full scope of his manipulation. Additional witnesses came forward once Barnaby's courage had demonstrated that truth could finally be spoken without fear of consequence, each new testimony adding further weight to the case against him. Elira and Cassian remained in the capital throughout this period, called upon frequently to provide additional evidence and testimony as the investigation unfolded. The court that had once whispered cruel judgments about the disgraced princess now watched her with something closer to grudging respect, recognizing the courage and determination she had shown in uncovering truth that powerful men had worked hard to bury. Her father, the old king, summoned her privately during this period, his expression carrying visible shame as he addressed her for the first time since her original disgrace. "I failed you terribly, Elira," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I allowed Hensworth's counsel to guide my judgment without questioning his motives, believing myself protecting the crown's interests when I was, in truth, simply following the manipulations of a man determined to reshape this kingdom entirely for his own benefit." "You believe the evidence presented to you," Elira replied, though old hurt still lingered beneath her measured words. "I do not know if I can easily forgive how quickly you abandoned me, father, but I understand now that you, too, were deceived by a man skilled in manipulation and deception. I hope, in time, we might rebuild what Hensworth's schemes damaged between us," the king said quietly. "You have shown remarkable strength throughout this ordeal, strength I fear I failed to recognize or honor when you needed my support most." Elira left that conversation with complicated emotions, old wounds not fully healed but perhaps beginning, slowly, to mend. Whatever reconciliation might eventually be possible with her father, she understood it would require time and patience neither of them could rush. As formal proceedings against Hensworth concluded, with overwhelming evidence finally forcing a full confession regarding his decade-long scheme of manipulation and corruption, both the Voss and Rourke families received formal restoration of honor before the entire court. Elira's original charges of treason were officially overturned, her name cleared publicly, in a ceremony that felt like closing a painful chapter she had carried for months. That evening, following the formal ceremony restoring both their families' honor, Cassian requested a private audience with Elira in the gardens behind the estate they had returned to, once the proceedings finally concluded. She found him standing near a small fountain, moonlight casting soft silver light across the water's gentle surface, his expression carrying a nervousness she had rarely witnessed from him before. "You seem troubled," Elira said, approaching him slowly. "I would have thought tonight, of all nights, might finally bring you some peace." "I am troubled," Cassian admitted, turning to face her fully, "though not for the reasons you might expect. I find myself standing here, finally free from the burden of revenge that consumed so much of my life, and realizing that everything I once believed I wanted pales entirely, compared to what I have come to feel for you these past months." Elira's heart pounded at the raw vulnerability in his voice, her breath catching as he stepped closer, taking her hands gently in his own. "When I married you, Elira, I sought only to humiliate the family that I believed had destroyed mine," he continued, his voice growing rougher with emotion. "I never imagined that within that cold, calculated arrangement, I would find someone whose courage, intelligence, and compassion would completely transform everything I believed about myself and about what I deserved from life." "Cassian," Elira whispered, though he continued before she could say more. "I have spent these past weeks watching you fight, not simply for your own justice, but for mine as well," he said. "I have watched you extend kindness to servants who once viewed you with suspicion, courage before tribunals that could have easily condemned you alongside me, and tenderness that has slowly healed wounds I believed would remain forever open. I love you, Elira. Not the marriage of convenience I once envisioned, but genuinely, completely, in a way I never believed myself capable of feeling again, after everything my family endured." Tears gathered in Alira's eyes at his confession, her heart overflowing with emotions she had struggled to fully name until this very moment. "I love you as well, Cassian," she said softly. "What began as bitter circumstance has become the truest, most precious connection I have ever known. I do not know how to express how deeply grateful I am that fate brought us together, however painful our beginning may have been." Cassian's expression softened entirely, relief and joy mixing visibly across his features as he reached up gently, cupping her face in his hands. "I have wanted to kiss you properly for longer than I care to admit," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Not the formal, empty gesture expected of a wedding ceremony, but something real, something that reflects everything I have come to feel for you these past months. Would you allow me that, Alira? Just one kiss, freely given, free from politics, revenge, or obligation." Alira's answer came not in words, but in the gentle way she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed as she waited, her heart pounding with anticipation and joy she had never expected to feel again, after the devastating scandal that once threatened to destroy her entirely. Cassian closed the remaining distance between them slowly, his lips meeting hers with a tenderness that spoke of everything unspoken between them these past months, every quiet moment of growing trust, every shared vulnerability, every small act of loyalty that had gradually transformed bitter enemies into devoted partners. The kiss deepened gently, filled with genuine affection rather than the cold obligation that had once defined their union, and Alira felt every remaining wall around her heart finally crumble entirely. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Cassian rested his forehead gently against hers, a soft smile playing across his lips. "I have waited far too long for that," he murmured. "Then perhaps we should not wait any longer, for whatever comes next," Alira replied softly, her own smile matching his entirely. "What do you mean?" Cassian asked, curiosity and hope mixing in his expression. "I mean," Alira said, taking his hands in hers once more, "that our marriage began as a cold arrangement built from spite and revenge, witnessed only by those who wish to see us both suffer under its weight. I would like very much to exchange vows again, Cassian, properly this time, surrounded by genuine joy rather than bitter obligation, sealing a bond built from love rather than humiliation." Cassian's eyes brightened with unmistakable joy at her suggestion. "Nothing would make me happier, Alira Rourke," he said, using her married name with evident pride for the very first time. "Let us begin our marriage anew, properly, with vows that reflect everything true between us now, rather than the bitter circumstances that first bound us together." Standing together beneath the moonlit garden, hands intertwined and hearts finally united in genuine love rather than calculated revenge, Alira felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The painful scandal and cruel humiliation of months past, finally giving way to a future built on trust, respect, and a love neither of them had ever expected to find within their unlikely, once bitter union. Spring arrived at the Rourke estate with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the transformation that had taken place within its walls over the past months. The neglected gardens Alira had first noticed upon her arrival now bloomed vibrantly, tended carefully under her patient guidance, the estate staff working alongside her with genuine warmth, rather than the wary suspicion that had once greeted her presence. Preparations for the new wedding ceremony had occupied much of the household's attention throughout the preceding weeks, though this time the atmosphere carried none of the coldness that had defined their original union. Grace, now serving as Alira's personal attendant by her own request, moved through the preparations with visible excitement, while even Margaret, the once stern household manager, had softened considerably toward the woman she now recognized as a genuine and worthy duchess. "I must admit, Your Highness," Margaret said one afternoon, helping Alira select fabric for her wedding gown, "I misjudged you terribly when you first arrived. I believed you simply another spoiled noble, incapable of surviving the challenges this household might present. I have rarely been more grateful to be proven wrong." "You had every reason for caution, Margaret," Alira replied warmly. "Given everything the Rourke family suffered because of circumstances connected to my family's name, your wariness was entirely understandable." "Regardless," Margaret said, "I am pleased beyond words to see the happiness you and the Duke have found together. It is rare indeed to witness such a transformation, and rarer still to see it so thoroughly deserved." The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear, sunlight streaming through Elira's chamber windows, as Grace helped her dress in a gown far more elaborate than the simple ivory dress she had worn during their original hollow ceremony. This gown, crafted from delicate silk and adorned with subtle embroidery, reflected the genuine joy she now carried into this second exchange of vows.
"You look radiant, Your Highness," Grace said, tears of genuine happiness gathering in her eyes as she completed the final adjustments to Elira's gown.
"I do not believe I have ever seen you smile so freely as you have these past weeks. I have never had such genuine reason to smile, Grace," Elira replied softly, studying her reflection, with quiet wonder at how completely her circumstances had transformed since that first devastating day when guards had stripped the crown from her hair. The ceremony took place in the same chapel where their original hollow vows had been exchanged, though this time the small stone room overflowed with genuine well-wishers, rather than the handful of indifferent witnesses who had attended their first wedding. Her father, the king, sat proudly among the gathered guests, alongside nobles who had once whispered cruel judgments, but now offered genuine celebration at the remarkable love story that had unfolded from such bitter beginnings. Cassian stood waiting at the altar as Elira walked toward him, his expression carrying none of the cold detachment from their original ceremony, replaced entirely by open adoration that brought fresh tears to her eyes. When she reached him, he took her hands gently, his thumbs brushing softly across her knuckles in the same tender gesture that had first hinted at the affection growing quietly between them during their journey north. "I promise to cherish you completely, Elira," Cassian said, his voice carrying genuine emotion as he spoke his vows, departing entirely from the flat, businesslike tone of their original ceremony. "To stand beside you through whatever challenges life may bring, to celebrate your triumphs and comfort your sorrows, and to love you with everything I possess, for as long as I am given breath to do so." Elira's voice trembled slightly, with joyful emotion, as she spoke her own vows in return. "I promise to walk beside you always, Cassian, through both storm and sunshine alike. What began between us, as bitter circumstance, has become the greatest gift I have ever received, and I intend to honor that gift every single day of our life together, cherishing you as deeply as you have come to cherish me." When the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife once more, this time with genuine meaning behind the sacred words, Cassian did not hesitate as he had during their original ceremony. He drew Elira close, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss filled with all the tenderness and devotion that had grown steadily between them since that first cold day of their unlikely marriage. The gathered guests erupted into genuine applause and joyful celebration, a stark contrast to the indifferent silence that had followed their original vows. As they finally parted, both smiling brightly amid the celebration surrounding them, Cassian rested his forehead gently against hers once more, echoing the tender gesture from the moonlit garden where he had first confessed his love. "I never imagined, when I sought you out purely from spite and old grievances, that I would find within our marriage the greatest happiness I have ever known," he murmured softly, meant only for her ears amid the surrounding celebration. "Nor did I imagine, standing accused and disgraced before an unforgiving court, that I would find genuine love waiting within the very marriage designed to humiliate me," Elira replied, her heart overflowing with joy as she gazed into the eyes of the man who had transformed from cold enemy into devoted husband. Their celebration continued long into the evening, filled with music, laughter, and genuine warmth that stood in stark contrast to the cold formality of their original union. Elira danced with Cassian beneath strings of soft lantern light, surrounded by well-wishers who had witnessed their remarkable journey from bitter enemies to devoted partners, a transformation built not from grand gestures alone, but from quiet moments of courage, honesty, and gradually deepening trust. Later that evening, as the celebration finally began winding down and guests departed toward their own homes, Cassian led Elira out into the gardens she had so carefully restored, moonlight illuminating the blooming flowers around them in soft silver light. "Whatever challenges the future may bring," Cassian said softly, drawing her close beneath the star-filled sky, "I know now that I wish to face them beside you, and only you, for the remainder of my days." "As do I," Elira replied, resting her head gently against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear. "We have already survived scandal betrayal, and the schemes of a man determined to destroy us both. Whatever else life presents, I have no doubt we shall face it together, stronger for everything that has already tested us. Cassian pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, his arms wrapping securely around her beneath the moonlit sky. Then let our true story begin here, Elira, he said softly, not with humiliation or revenge, but with genuine love, freely given and gratefully received, a foundation strong enough to carry us through whatever years still lie ahead. And beneath that same moonlit sky, where he had once begged for a single kiss, Elira Rourke, once the shamed princess and now the truly beloved duchess, felt nothing but profound gratitude for the unexpected journey that had led her from devastating disgrace to a love more genuine and precious than she had ever dared to imagine possible.